Austerity is the big financial buzzword in Europe, at least. The UK is the latest European nation to take an axe to its budget, cutting in many areas and increasing taxes in order to try and get its fiscal house in order. That's obviously happening across the continent as well, as the European debt crisis is really roiling not just Europe but the entire global market. However, in the U.S., cutting the deficit and debt doesn't seem to be as big a priority as stimulus, trying to get the economy back on track, ending the recession, or at least having a stronger recovery than what we're seeing right now. And there may be some tension because of that, because the U.S. kind of stands alone in its calls for continued stimulus, continued spending to get the global economy back on track. And a lot of people think that's a bad idea, that we need to be focusing on debt and deficits now. What do you think? Almost all the comments were in favor of cutting the deficit now. Matthew Wilhelm wrote, "This is the biggest Band-Aid we've ever had, and we need to quit being wusses and just rip it off. Immediate deficit reduction undeniably improves efficiency and gives consumers confidence to spend." It's a good point. I'm not 100% sure that that will be the case if you do, in fact, reduce the deficit and cut debt by cutting back on government spending and also increasing taxes. That may not really give consumers confidence, but he's right that we do need to rip that Band-Aid off and kind of just tackle the problem sooner rather than later. Barry Black argues that the U.S. actually has to emulate Europe. The elephant in the room is inflation, and when it hits the USA, it will happen in a flash. With the European nations constricting their economies, it will shorten the time for inflation to bite the USA in the rear unless the USA follows the lead of Europe. A great point. And that's, I think, what one of many of the deficit hawks are really most concerned about, that interest rates are so low. We're pumping out treasuries in order to finance a lot of the stimulus and spending, and that could lead to inflation down the road, and it could happen really quickly. Tim Bachler said the problem isn't that the U.S. necessarily spent too much, however, but it didn't spend wisely. Okay, so the $882 billion we already spent didn't do it. The solution is to spend more. The original stimulus was not spent with the intent to stimulate. How about just reallocating the current money to things that will actually create jobs? Great point. And clearly, the labor market is the main laggard in this economic recovery that seems to be gradually unfolding in the U.S. You don't really have an explosion in hiring just yet, and I think that's something that a lot of people really want to see in order to have confidence that this recovery is really taking hold. However, at least one brave buzz reader isn't a deficit hawk. Scott Colweiler writes, "Thank heavens our grandparents didn't think like this during World War II, when deficits were 2 times or 3 times as large as now for 5 years straight, and the national debt ratio for debt held by the private sector was eventually twice as big as now. Given current thinking and most of the comments here in favor of reducing deficits, a double-dip recession is pretty much unavoidable." I think that is definitely a great point to conclude with, and a lot of people are critical of what's going on in Europe, saying that they are just stalling their own economic recovery because the budget cuts are so severe, and that could happen in the U.S. if we drastically cut our budgets as well. That's probably true, but we can't stimulate the economy and hope for growth in the short term and put off fixing the long-term problems. That obviously needs to be addressed as well.